Speaker, as our House of Representatives continues its fight against human trafficking, I rise in support of this legislation. It is called the Human Trafficking Prioritization Act. This legislation will elevate consideration of trafficking issues within the Department of State to ensure that they receive the same attention as other diplomatic concerns. Now, this is a struggle we've had for some time, trying to elevate these issues so that they're on par and given the seriousness that we have tried to drive here in Congress. Congress created the Department of State's Office to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. We created that institution a decade and a half ago. We did it in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. The purpose of this office was to better communicate and coordinate U.S. government efforts to combat both domestic and international trafficking. In line with this mandate, the office prepares the annual Trafficking in Persons report, which details anti-trafficking efforts of other countries and classifies countries as falling into one of three tiers based on their efforts to combat human trafficking. And these tip reports and their tier rankings have proven, as you know, extremely useful in helping our diplomats fight human trafficking. It allows us to transform this issue into a global policy priority. We know that foreign governments have made real improvements in their work to combat trafficking as a result of these tip reports. And the reason this is so, of course, is because as you talk to foreign governments, they are very concerned about the threat of a low-tier ranking. That gets international attention today. That's sort of the leverage that we have on these governments to pass laws that are serious about going after trafficking. But we also understand that this annual exercise is periodically constrained by the Department's regional diplomats who fear we may agitate foreign governments when hard truths surface. A former ambassador at large on trafficking issues testified before Congress that the Department sometimes pulls its punches and defers to regional specialists on the TIPS report's tier rankings rather than the TIP office's trafficking experts. Well, this is what we want to counter, because what we want is the maximum pressure for foreign governments to follow through on their international commitments to try to abolish human trafficking. By elevating the trafficking office to a bureau, this measure will give these experts the bureaucratic standing they need to ensure their concerns are fully heard, effectively leveling the playing field for this annual process. And I want to thank the gentleman, by the way, from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, the chairman of our Human Rights Subcommittee, for his years of leadership in this fight against human trafficking and for reintroducing this bill, which passed this House last July. I'll also thank Mr. Cicilline, and I want to thank him specifically for his efforts as we've traveled in Asia to pressure these governments to end human trafficking, and I urge the members to support this important measure, and I'm going to reserve the balance of my time. Mr. Speaker, the international Megan's Law to prevent demand for child sex trafficking will strengthen law enforcement efforts to combat this rather horrific crime that damages hundreds of thousands of young children worldwide every year. This bill before us today was passed unanimously by the House in the last Congress in substantially the same form. This year, we hope to engage the Senate and get it to the President's desk. And over the years, Congress has passed laws including Megan's Law and the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act to require the registration and require the public notification of convicted sex offenders. And these steps have helped families and communities protect their children, and have helped law enforcement officials investigate and certainly prosecute domestic cases involving repeat sex offenders. A growing problem, however, is the appalling industry of child sex tourism, in which adults travel overseas to exploit children in other countries. Unfortunately, a significant number of Americans are engaging in this practice, and engaging it while the countries of destination lack sufficient resources to deal with the rising number of child predators. Many children victimized by this terrible crime have also been trafficked, and that is recruited or transferred to be exploited for someone else's profit. The international law helps us fight back. At present, there are multiple U.S. agencies seeking to combat human trafficking and combat child sex tourism. By better coordinating their efforts, we can be much more effective. And importantly, our proactive efforts to help countries identify incoming child predators will also encourage them to alert us when those foreigners convicted of sex offenses against children attempt themselves to enter into the United States. In particular, this bill officially recognizes an Angel Watch Center within the Department of Homeland Security's Child Exploitation Investigation Center. Operation Angel Watch originated as a partnership with the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and currently collects and analyzes the foreign travel date of convicted child sex offenders to determine whether notification to U.S. officials or foreign governments is warranted. Last year alone, Angel Watch sent over 2,000 leads to nearly 100 countries as part of this effort to proactively and strategically alert international law enforcement. So this bill solidifies the Angel Watch Center as an important part of the U.S. response to child sex tourism, and importantly, it improves the timelines of the information that the center receives by requiring the Justice Department to share its travel records promptly. This will allow Angel Watch to better detect and report the travel of child predators. Now, we do have one change in this bill from last year, and that bill is an additional rule of construction which states that nothing in this act will impede any investigations being carried out by the Department of Homeland Security. This was added at the request of non-governmental organizations who were concerned that the bill's activities could divert resources from the Department's other investigative work. To avoid any confusion, I want to make clear that this rule of construction does not supersede the bill's general notification provisions, which require the Department of Homeland Security to attempt to alert a convicted offender whose travel is reported to their country of destination. These general notification provisions were the product of a bipartisan agreement, and I want to state my appreciation for the good work of those staffers who came together from across the aisle and from different committees to develop them. And I want to thank the bill's author, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, for his persistent leadership, his persistent dedication to this issue. And I would also like to recognize the chairman and ranking member of the Committee on the Judiciary, as well as Ranking Member Engel and Mr. Cicilline, for their collaboration on this bill, which I encourage all members to support. I reserve the balance of my time. Mr. Speaker, I rise today as a committed participant in this body's decade-and-a-half-long fight against human trafficking since the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. Although we have made some progress, and although I think we've raised global awareness on this issue, there are still, today, somewhere around 20 million people around the world who remain subject to the horrors of this modern-day slavery, either through trafficking for exploitation for work or child sex trafficking. And most of these victims are women, and many, as you know, Mr. Speaker, are children. Given the high stakes, U.S. officials working overseas must be able to recognize the signs, the telltale signs of this terrible crime. And if they do not know which groups are most vulnerable or what activities should raise their suspicions, then successful action is very unlikely. Though current law requires the State Department personnel to be trained to identify trafficking victims, it does not prescribe how they should be trained. And this bill does. The Human Trafficking Prevention Act would specify minimum training requirements for the Department of State, and these would include a training course for department personnel who deal with trafficking issues, in addition to trafficking briefings for all of our ambassadors and all our deputy chiefs of mission before they depart to their posts. And it also ensures that U.S. officials stationed overseas get annual updates on trafficking-related developments related to the countries where they are working. Listen, we have done a lot to move legislation to force other countries to adopt legislation. But our ambassadors overseas and their deputies overseas need this education. While the State Department currently appears to be meeting many of the standards, we all know that practices can change, and by specifying reasonable minimum requirements for training, this bill strengthens existing law at no additional cost to our taxpayers. And I want to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Maloney, who authored this measure, which passed as H.R. 4449 during the last Congress. And I want to thank him for reintroducing the bill that's before us today. And while we are discussing improvements to the anti-trafficking practices of our foreign affairs agencies, I also want to invite my colleagues to co-sponsor H.R. 400, the Bipartisan Trafficking Prevention in Foreign Affairs Contracting Act, that my ranking member of the committee, Eliot Engel, and I recently introduced, which we hope to move forward promptly. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.